John, thank you very much for that introduction. I hope you can hear me okay. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be invited back to speak with you. A number of you were at this event 12 months ago in Brighton, and I've been asked to come back this year and just give a bit of an update on where HEDIIP is, what we've been doing, and where on earth we think we're going. So I really want to talk about what's been happening most recently and where we're going, but I want to just say before that a few words about the context, the introduction, the challenges that we face. So the challenge that we face, well, the context for this challenge, I mean, we've had some brilliant presentations already at this conference. We had some really quite mind-blowing, mind-expanding stuff this morning with Rachel about the way we need to think, the way we need to address some of these issues. But there is a sense in which, the whole world is changing, the whole game is changing. And I start off with this fellow. Now, I know what you're thinking. Peter Tinson after a night on the Scrumpy. But no, this is your man here who very famously said, Gil Scott-Heron, who very famously said in 1971, the revolution will not be televised. It was the B-side to his single, Home is Where the Hatred Is. I'm sure you all know it. Beat poet, the revolution will not be televised. This was the phrase, the slogan from the Black Power movement in the 1960s. And they were kind of right. It did not take place on the television, but it did not, however, take place on the streets of Detroit and Brooklyn, because the revolution is happening all around us. The revolution is, of course, the technology. So it has not been televised, but the revolution, of course, has a hashtag now. So that's the world we're living through. That is how IT looked maybe not that many years ago. And I'm sure there are some people in the room who might remember machines not dissimilar to this. When I started working at Rolls-Royce in the 1980s, the computer I used had its own building, and the laser printer I used had a building next to it. And that was how IT was in the 1980s. And of course, Moore's law, blah, 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 you all know that, double everything every 18 months. And of course, technology now is so beautiful and so desirable, and we all want the Apple Watch, don't we? As soon as Apple have figured out how to make the battery last more than 27 minutes, we're all going to rush out and buy one in the new year. But it has, and even in much shorter period, much more recent history, we are all now carrying supercomputers around in our pockets, and the machines that we're carrying around in our pockets are not dissimilar to the sort of processing capability that we used to run our sector agencies on only 15, 20 years ago. And there you go, UCAS get the iPhone 5. Obviously, all that power, all that capability, all that connectivity is there. And the whole world is changing, and the whole relationship with data and the way we think about these things and the way it all works is changing. 2011, the white paper set us a challenge to redesign the information landscape. I've met the people who drafted the white paper. They pore over every word, so they did not say a review, they did not say fiddle about, they did not say tweak. They said redesign. It's really bold language. It's a mandate to be bold. 3 broad objectives. The first, a system that meets the needs of a wider group of users. This is about open data. This is about accessibility. This is about well-informed students, the mantra of a lot of government policy recently. The white paper said reduces duplication. Very interesting, it didn't say burden. But we've been trying to think more broadly about burden ever since we started on this program. And results in timelier and more relevant data. And there's something in here about data quality as well. That is the challenge that has been set, and as of August last year, a new acronym for us all to reckon with, HEDIIP, the Higher Education Data and Information Improvement Programme, was established. The programme has been working very closely with a huge range of stakeholders because the information landscape is broad, it is very complex, and actually a big part of the challenge is to understand the landscape and understand the drivers and what makes people operate and how it work in the way they do. So we have done a huge amount of work of engagement. ucisa is there at the top, and that is no accident because this community has an understanding of some of the issues and a perspective on some of the issues, and I think in many senses will turn out to be key to unlocking a lot of the change that we need to drive amongst the data collectors and institutions. So I am especially delighted that we've got both Peter and Luke involved with the HEDIIP advisory panel, working with us on individual projects and helping steer the programme more generally. But that is just a few of the organisations and bodies that we are working with. So I want to say a few words after the challenge about the action and things that we've done. Well, some of this might resonate from the stuff we talked about last year. We've created the inventory of data collections. That went live over a year ago. It's a living document. It's an Excel file, because obviously we all love Excel. It's an Excel file. We currently have 523 higher education data collections listed on the inventory. I had an email this morning to tell me there's some missing, and I'm sure there are many missing. I'm sure it is not complete, and even if it was complete last week, it's probably not complete this week, okay? 523 data collections because you're in the business of HE. So this does not include stuff like companies' house reporting or health and safety reporting that you have to do because you employ people, all right? This is because you're in the business of higher education. 523 different data collections. There are 93 organisations collecting student data from you every year. There has to be a better way of doing this, okay? And that's kind of the evidence, that's the sort of platform from which we start to do this work. We've done some work around the data language. We published about 12 months ago the lexicon and thesaurus to try and disambiguate some of the terms that we all struggle with. What is a student? What is a course? At the workshop we ran last night, we heard a lot about the pain, about the burden, about the unnecessary burden of all of these different data collectors coming to you asking for very similar data using slightly different definitions, and so your response to all of these data collections is a unique separate transformation exercise from your internal data to their requirements, okay? And we just so far have not been able to pull that together, and because all the data collectors are off doing their own thing, working in their own silo mentality, they just say, well, I'll make up the data collections definitions that I want. And I won't refer to anyone else, and so we've got a real challenge there. So that work so far is with the lexicon thesaurus. Review of student data collections. We commissioned John Townsend, who many of you will know, formerly of this parish, to go out. We took that 93 organisations that collect student data every year. The inventory is okay, it says the collections exist. What we don't know from the inventory is why they're collecting it, how they're collecting it, exactly what data is being involved, some feeling for the processes around it. So John went out and interviewed about a third of those organisations. He sat down with them face to face and sort of scratched beneath the surface of what is driving so many different organisations to collect their data. How are they doing it? What sort of management governance and what sort of technical processes are they employing to do that? And what are the opportunities and what are the barriers to standardising this stuff or potentially even rationalising this stuff? So John has produced, I think, a very excellent, very detailed report which is available on the HEDIIP website. John has come up with a very useful classification of the drivers for data collection, the reasons people collect data, and he sort of used some of the enterprise architecture toolkit to help us model some of that. He has come to the conclusion that, I mean, possibly not surprisingly, but it's really good to have this confirmed, there is a core of student data that everyone is interested in. Yeah? Who are your students and what course are they on? Yeah, fairly fundamental stuff, and there is a core that sort of everybody wants, and there is scope for rationalising and standardising around that core of student data. It might seem obvious, but actually to have the evidence there is really important if we are going to move this conversation on with some of these organisations. So that report is there, and that is a very significant piece in this journey. We did the initial studies around the ULN and subject coding in higher education. We are now doing a piece of work live at the moment to look at the adoption of the unique learner number or student identifier issues more generally around higher education. We think there are 16, possibly 20 different person identifiers, student identifiers that your systems have to deal with. All right, and that's not good. All right, that's not good because fundamentally throughout the higher education life cycle, whether they are an applicant or a student or an alumnus, it is a person, and we need a way of identifying a person, and everybody does it differently. Okay, so the ULN exists. The ULN is embedded now in schools and further education in England and Wales. It is attached to a personal learner record, and as of this summer, the personal learner record is systematically now being populated with qualifications information from the level 1, 2, 3 awarding bodies. And so over the next year or two, there's a whole cohort of young people moving into higher education who will have a ULN and who will have all of their qualifications data on the personal learner record. It's going live in Northern Ireland September of next year. Okay? Scotland has the Scottish candidate number, which is very well established, very well embedded into all sorts of systems there. And there is a conversation that we are kicking off now with the Scottish Qualification Authority about how we can bridge the ULN and the Scottish candidate number together. All right, but there has to be a smarter way of linking students, of linking student data. If we're going to rationalise all this data collection that goes on, most fundamentally we need a way to identify a student rather than 20 different ways to identify a student. All right, it sounds bleeding obvious, frankly, all right? But you know, this is kind of what we're doing here. So in the spring of next year, we're going to be setting out a plan for the adoption, looking at the points at which ULN can come into the system, looking at the processes that might need to be changed, looking at the benefits that will be realised from this, trying to get some grip on the costs of making these changes, and really setting out the case for adopting the ULN in higher education, and therefore starting to rationalise this probably most fundamental issue of how do we identify students. Subject coding. So you might have heard of a system called JACS, the Joint Academic Classification System, which has been around since the mid-90s, used by HEDIIP and UCAS. About 18 months ago, we published a report undertaken by Dr. Jill Ferrell, looking at all the various problems and misinterpretations around subject coding. So in March, April of this year, we appointed a team at CISG to develop a new approach to subject coding in higher education. Hugely significant project, because what CISG have done, which we never did when we created JACS, they've gone out and spoken to people and said, what do we need a subject coding system to do? Sounds bleeding obvious to you. It never happened when we put JACS together, all right? So there's been a whole load of work done on analysing the requirements. What actually do we need this system to do for us before we try and create a solution? And that is the stage one of this project, a detailed requirements analysis. I am delighted to be able to say that the report of stage one went live on the HEDIIP website this morning. Okay, we have published the report today. And it really is, it's a hyperbole, and it really is a landmark report for two reasons. Firstly, it is a landmark report in the journey to the new subject coding system, and that in itself is all well and good. But there is something about getting all of these different data collectors to have a conversation together, because historically they have all worked in their silos, and historically they've never spoken to each other about issues like this. So the fact that CISG have gone out and had this conversation with people and put together a combined set of principles and requirements to say, this is how we need to move forward, all right? And this, I think, is a brilliant, brilliant example of trying to change the way we think about working by working in a different way, all right? So this is important in terms of the subject coding, but I think this is an exemplar of the way that we all need to be working in the future. So we've just kicked off stage two. That is going to now start looking at developing a structure, building on the work in stage one to meet those requirements, and then populate that framework and define a standard approach to implementation. And this is where a lot of the data standards work in the past has gone wrong. People have kind of done the data standard, but then they said, so go and implement it, and they've kind of left it. And different implementations, you end up with different stuff that's not comparable, and you've wasted all that time and effort. So we have to make sure we build a standard approach to implementation in this. So exciting times on that. Data capability, we are just commissioning a piece of work to develop a capability maturity matrix to help organisations across the landscape, both institutions and data collectors and processors, with issues around the management and governance of data. Now, I know a lot of stuff exists at the moment in this space across many dimensions of this, and I know different institutions will be at different places on this journey. We're trying to put together something that stakeholders across the landscape can use in a sort of self-assessment fashion to help identify where they need to develop and support some of their activities. And then within that, pointers to existing resources, because there is already a huge amount of material out there, and in many cases people aren't aware what's out there or where to find it. And so there is some really good stuff on the ucisa website. There's some excellent stuff on the CISG14 website, and all sorts of other places. So it's really something, a tool to try and help bring this together, and something that is practical and usable for organisations within this space, and therefore also identifying gaps. So if there are any areas that we need to do some further work around, we can identify those. So the HE data language, I sort of touched on that earlier. We've made some progress with the Lexicon Thesaurus. There are a number of things happening in this space around data language, and this is something that HEDIIP is going to be picking up in the next couple of months. And I will also just mention there's a very, I think, exciting piece of work being sponsored by JISC at the moment. And if you get a chance to collar Toby Price over coffee, not all at the same time, he won't thank me for that, but I think Toby is doing some absolutely fantastic stuff looking at data modelling within institutions, and I'm quite excited by the idea of the data collectors looking at their data definitions from that way, and the institutions looking at their data definitions from that way, and maybe coming together in the middle. And if we're smart, we can make that happen. I think there's a lot of, I think the ducks are lined up now where we can possibly do something around that. So that's part of it. But that's all well and good. What we don't have at the moment is a vision. What we don't have at the moment is an answer to the question, what does success look like? What actually are we aiming for? And while, you know, the ULN and the subject coding and the inventory, that's all kind of good foundational stuff, we don't have that roadmap at the moment. So we have commissioned KPMG to help us define that vision, and a new architecture for the information landscape, the building blocks of a new architecture. What do we need to have in place to sort of undo the last 2 decades of siloed working? And when I say siloed working, I mean siloed working amongst the data collectors, and also, I guess, siloed working within institutions. And I think there are silos, there's an extent to which that silo thing is reflected on both sides of that data collection interface. And so we've been doing some work with KPMG to answer kind of 3 fundamental questions. What should a redesigned landscape look like? How will we know when we've got there? And then also give us some sense as to what the next steps in this journey need to be, and create a vision and a strategy for achieving that vision. And I think that is something that the information has lacked over the last 20 years, which is why actually we're in the terrible mess that we are all now in, and why everyone sees data as a burden rather than seeing data as something with value and something with opportunity. We had a number of people come after yesterday's conference join us last night to talk around some of the issues around the future landscape. We had some really valuable input there talking about the burden, the perception of the burden, the reality of the burden, what drives the burden, and just some of the issues about the inconsistency and how the way the data collectors behave forces certain behaviours upon the institutions. And at the moment we seem to be in a vicious cycle with some of that, and we need to try and break that vicious cycle if we are to make progress on this journey. So that report will be coming out in March of next year, and that will be, I think, the significant milestone on this journey, where we can then take stock and say, okay, we now have a sense of where we're going with this big picture, and we can all take the next steps forward. So that really is everything I was planning to say. Thank you very much for inviting me. I would happily take any questions if anyone has any. Jonathan.
Hi, Andy. I'm just curious as to whether you've anticipated any potential styles of architecture or outcomes. So I tend to go to the solution a little bit too early for you, I know, but
Yeah.
I'd be interested on your thoughts.
I would be lying if I said Andy Youell didn't have some views. Yeah? Because obviously I have some ideas. But, you know, this is, I don't rule the world. And actually HEDIIP doesn't rule the world. HEDIIP doesn't have power or authority. One of the most challenging things about the new landscape piece is the fact that not only does it have to come up with an architecture that delivers against those objectives, reduce the burden and make the data faster and better and more accessible, but it also has to be something that gains consensus. And I think there's a sense in which almost that consensus bit might be far more difficult. I'm sure we could all, go in and design an architecture for how data should work across the HE sector. And if we ruled the world, then we'd just bloody well make it happen, that'll be fine. But we can't do that. It is a negotiation process, a consensus building process. So whatever my views are actually probably not really very important. So I'm going to completely swerve that question. Thank you, Jonathan.
Elegantly.
Hi Andy, Toby Price, that's me. I can't actually think of a question, but I just thought I'd let everyone know that I'm Toby Price and I'm working on the JISC project, so the one that Andy mentioned.
Good.
Hi Andy. Is there any sense yet of what the student profile of the unique learner number will provide? Because we've been approached several times recently by actually local authorities, and one of the things they're really interested in is what happens to their pupils who had free school meals. Do they go into higher education, and how do they do?
Yep.
And it's one of the sort of questions that I've been batting back for a little while,
Yep.
but I'd be interested if you know if there's that sort of level of data is available or will be available.
Okay, so the unique learner number is an identifier. There is something called the personal learner record, which is attached to the ULN. That holds qualifications achieved. Okay? The ULN record itself holds very little about the person. It holds name, gender, date of birth, and I think home postcode. So all sorts of other interesting, valuable things, socioeconomic background, ethnicity, gender, all those other things, they are not there. However, I think the real potential of the ULN is getting it embedded in all of these different data systems that exist across education, because once you have got that in, you can then do far better linking between data sets. And so the ULN will itself not give you, for example, free school meal information. It will unlock the ability to link your data to whoever holds the FSM data. There are still issues around data sharing and protocols and data protection that need to be undergone that. So, it is not in itself the solution, but it is, I think, the enabler to start doing that sort of thing. And significantly, I think, amongst many of the data collectors, because there's a whole load of organisations out there collecting data at the individual student level, because, for example, the PSRBs, they want to identify, they need to identify individuals. I think if we can get the ULN established out there, there is a really strong case to push back on a whole load of data collections that currently exist. So the ULN itself doesn't hold the data, it's the enabler to pull it together.
Okay, that sounds a bit like health records and other things that have been controversial in the past. Perhaps capture it. Whose data is this? Is it the universities? Is it the data collectors? Or is it the students?
Yeah, so you might need a lawyer to answer that question. I could get in serious trouble if I attempted to answer that question. I guess there's an argument to say that each of those stakeholders have a major stake in the data. Obviously, the data that universities hold is universities' data. The data that the data collectors hold, I suspect, could be argued that it's their data. And obviously the subject of the data under data protection has rights to that data as well. So it's a very complex area. I'm not even going to attempt to answer that question. What I will, however, say, though, very interestingly, you mentioned the NHS experience. And what the NHS in England did was tried to do a really big £12 billion, we're going to impose this on you thing. And from the ground, they said, bugger off. And it didn't happen, yeah? They took a very different approach in Scotland with the NHS, with the e-health programme in Scotland. They put together a programme of work, defined a vision that people bought into, and then seeded projects to help individual stakeholders work towards that vision. That is actually the model that informed the creation of HEDIIP. And so while a lot of people talk about the NHS, meh, boo hiss, I would quite like to go, yay for the NHS in Scotland, because I think they absolutely got it right, and that is the approach we're trying to take.